The narrative of China's modern ascent is often presented through data, graphs, and geopolitical analyses. However, beneath these statistics lies a profoundly human story, one deeply shaped by the life of a man who eventually led the world's most populous nation. Long before he appeared on the global stage, before he crafted economic blueprints or spearheaded transformative reforms, he was simply a boy growing up in a vast, evolving country still seeking its place in the international order. Before we get into the main content, please consider subscribing to my channel, giving a like, leaving a comment, and share and support me in bringing more great videos to you. Thank you so much. Born in 1953, he entered a China that was in the process of rebuilding after decades of turmoil. Cities were still hushed, villages were still recovering, and families everywhere sought stability in a land yet to find its equilibrium. His upbringing was far from luxurious. Despite his father standing as a revolutionary figure, the political climate was in constant flux, and his family experienced firsthand the consequences of this instability. During the Cultural Revolution, a period that fundamentally altered millions of lives, he was just a teenager. The ideological tempest that swept across China did not spare him. His father's fall from political grace had repercussions that extended to the entire family, as was common during those turbulent years. The young boy, once part of a politically prominent household, was suddenly thrust into an uncertain existence. Instead of classrooms and structured routines, he faced accusations, criticisms, and ultimately separation. At an age when most students were preparing for their futures, he was sent to the countryside, to the remote, rural areas where daily life was physically demanding and emotionally taxing. In the lust-covered hills of Shaanxi province, he shoveled earth, resided in a cave dwelling, and toiled alongside villagers who had known hardship their entire lives. The winters were brutal, the summers relentless, and food was never a guarantee. Yet, it was in these harsh conditions that the bedrock of his worldview began to solidify. He learned the value of quiet observation, of listening before speaking, and of enduring before reacting. He came to understand that leadership was not merely about ambition, but also about survival, about knowing how to adapt without being broken. Those around him would later remark on a sense of calmness that seemed unusual for someone so young. But it was not born of naivete. It was forged through adversity. Clinging to his aspirations, he repeatedly applied to join the Communist Party of China. Each rejection served as a reminder of his family's political misfortunes. Still, he persevered. By the mid-1970s, as the political atmosphere began to stabilize and China began to shift its focus from ideological conflict to reconstruction, he finally gained acceptance. This moment represented far more than a bureaucratic formality. It was a gateway back into a society from which he had been excluded. When China reopened its universities after years of closures, he entered Tsinghua University, one of the nation's most esteemed institutions. The campus, which tree-lined paths and tranquil courtyards, became the setting for yet another transformation. He studied chemical engineering, but more significantly, he studied systems, organizational frameworks, human dynamics, and the mechanics of governance. During these years, he began to grasp the complexities of leading such a vast nation. China itself was undergoing rapid change. Under new national leadership, economic reforms were introduced, foreign investment began to flow in, and the nation cautiously began to open itself to the world. Millions of people rose from poverty to new opportunities. However, these transformations were uneven, and the challenges ahead were considerable. For someone preparing to enter public service, it was a time brimming with both promise and responsibility. His early administrative roles took him far from the capital, to towns and provinces where he witnessed the multifaceted nature of Chinese society firsthand. In Hebei, Fujian, Zhejiang, and later Shanghai, he observed the diverse textures of Chinese life. Coastal trading hubs buzzing with fresh energy, inland regions still struggling to modernize, and rural villages caught between tradition and progress. Each region served as a unique learning experience. In Fujian, he concentrated on cross-strait economic relations and stability. In Zhejiang, a province renowned for its entrepreneurial spirit, he fostered the growth of small businesses and innovation. In Shanghai, China's financial epicenter, he stepped into a city that had already become an emblem of modern aspiration. These experiences shaped his understanding of China's internal and external interactions, how local issues intertwine with national objectives, and how economic progress could influence global perceptions. By the early 2000s, China's presence on the world stage was becoming undeniable. The country's manufacturing prowess was reshaping global supply chains. Its cities were expanding at unprecedented rates, and its diplomacy was beginning to influence regional dynamics across Asia. Leadership in China now meant leadership on a global scale. The decisions made in Beijing had implications for markets, borders, and alliances far beyond Asia. When he ultimately ascended to national leadership, the world watched with keen interest. By that point, China had become the world's second largest economy, a technological contender, and a pivotal player in discussions concerning trade, climate change, security, and economic development. His leadership style, measured, methodical, and rooted in discipline, was a product of the hard-won lessons of his youth. Yet part one of the story does not concentrate on policies or international strategies. Instead, it delves into human foundations of the leader. The boy who weathered political upheaval, the young man who endured rural hardship, the student shaped by a transforming nation, and the administrator who traversed diverse provinces, learning the rhythms of China from the ground up. These experiences would later inform his approach to power, stability, and China's role in the world. But those narratives are for later chapters. For now, Part 1 concludes with the image of a man who has navigated uncertainty and emerged disciplined, patient, and resolute, a leader shaped as much by adversity as by opportunity, standing at the threshold of a nation poised to enter a new era. As China moved into the late 1990s and early 2000s, a new era was unfolding, one defined by rapid development, technological ambition, and economic expansion. Across the country, factories vibrated with activity. Skyscrapers rose from once quiet districts, and millions of people migrated from rural villages to modern, bustling cities. Amid this wave of transformation, the man who had persevered through hardship, studied diligently, and worked steadily across numerous provinces was about to step onto a much grander stage. It was around this time that he entered the national political arena. His prior provincial experiences had given him a distinct advantage. He understood China not as an abstract concept, but as a vast mosaic of cultures, challenges, and ambitions. He had witnessed fishermen in Fujian struggling to secure their livelihoods, entrepreneurs in Zhejiang striving to build their businesses, and international companies in Shanghai negotiating their place in China's emerging markets. These encounters shaped his understanding of how local decisions were connected to the country's broader trajectory. By the mid-2000s, China was rapidly gaining global influence. Its entry into the World Trade Organization had transformed it into the world's workshop. Western companies depended on Chinese factories. Asian economies relied on Chinese demand, and global supply chains stretched from Shenzhen to distant ports. Leadership during such a time required not only political acumen, but also a firm grasp of how rapidly the world was changing. When he joined the central government, he did so with a reputation for being calm, methodical, and consistent in his approach. Colleagues often described him as a listener rather than a speaker, and when he did speak, the room would fall silent. His leadership approach was characterized by discipline and patience. He assessed risks carefully, yet acted decisively once he had made up his mind. As he took on national responsibilities, China confronted a series of paradoxes. It was ascendant, but unevenly. Many parts of the country remained impoverished, while others had become global centers of manufacturing and finance. The economy was expanding at an extraordinary pace, yet social issues, environmental challenges, wealth disparities, and rapid urbanization created new complexities. He dedicated considerable time to studying these subjects, meeting with local officials, visiting factories, walking through villages, and observing the lives of ordinary families. These visits were not merely symbolic. They were part of a broader effort to understand a balance between economic growth and social stability. He believed that a nation as vast as China required strong foundations, political cohesion, economic resilience, and a clear sense of direction. During this period, China's foreign relations were also evolving. The country was taking a more active role in Asia, forging trade partnerships and strengthening diplomatic ties. Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, and India were all recalibrating their economic and political strategies in response to China's rise. In Central Asia, energy cooperation gained momentum, and in Africa, Chinese infrastructure projects began to reshape urban landscapes. The leader-to-be watched these developments closely. He understood that China's reform era had opened a new chapter, one in which the country could no longer remain inward-looking. The world was changing too rapidly, and China's future would be shaped not only by domestic choices, but also by its role within the global community. As he rose through the political ranks, he became increasingly aware of the weight of leadership. China's size, population, and economic influence meant that even small decisions could ripple across continents. The balance between continuity and change became a central theme in his thinking. How could China modernize while preserving stability? How could it grow without losing its identity? How could it adapt to global trends without being overwhelmed by them? These questions accompanied him as he advanced into the upper echelons of national governance. By the early 2010s, he had become one of the most prominent figures in China's leadership circle. Those around him sensed that he carried not only the lessons of his personal history, but also the accumulated observations of decades spent traversing China's provinces. His worldview was shaped by rural hardship, urban dynamism, coastal modernization, and the quiet discipline he had cultivated in his early political years. He was preparing for responsibilities that extended far beyond managing a single province or region. The decisions he would soon face involved the direction of an entire nation, and, indirectly, the relationship between China and the rest of the world. When he finally assumed leadership at the national level, China stood at a crossroads. The country was powerful yet cautious, ambitious yet aware of its vulnerabilities. It had lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, but social pressures persisted. It had become a global manufacturing powerhouse, yet sought a new identity beyond being the world's factory. Its cities gleamed with modernity, but its environment bore the scars of rapid growth. In his early years of leadership, he emphasized themes that reflected both his personal history and his observations: discipline, stability, unity, and renewal. He framed China's development as a long-term journey, one requiring balance between tradition and innovation, domestic responsibilities, and international engagement. He began strengthening anti-corruption measures, arguing that a government must remain disciplined to maintain trust. At the same time, he pushed for continued modernization, technological development, and regional connectivity. These early policies signaled a leader who valued structure and long-term planning, shaped by decades of observing how different parts of China functioned. Imagining him in those early leadership years, one might picture a man standing on a quiet balcony overlooking Beijing at night, lights stretching to the horizon, the hum of a modern metropolis rising into the air. Behind him lay the rural caves of Shaanxi, the markets of Fujian, the entrepreneurial workshops of Zhejiang, and the skyscrapers of Shanghai. Ahead of him lay decisions that would influence Asia and much of the world. When he stepped into the highest leadership role, China was already a global force, but a force in need of direction. The country was powerful, yet uncertain, ambitious, yet cautious. It had lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, but faced new forms of inequality. It had become the world's factory, yet was seeking its own technological path. As he stood at the center of this shifting landscape, he faced not only the expectations of 4 billion people, but the gaze of an increasingly interconnected world. The first years of his leadership were defined by a sense of consolidation. China had grown rapidly for decades, and there was a noticeable desire to bring order to the pace of change. He emphasized governance, discipline, and long-term stability. Many within his administration believed that China was entering a new phase, no longer simply catching up with the world, but determining how it wished to shape the future. One of the earliest themes he introduced was the idea of national rejuvenation. For many in China, this phrase carried a deep historical resonance. It evoked images of a country that had endured hardship, fragmentation, and foreign pressures, yet continued to rise anew. His message was not framed as a dramatic promise, but as a long road built on steady steps: education, innovation, cultural confidence, and economic restructuring. At the same time, he began strengthening internal governance. Anti-corruption campaigns swept through every level of the government. High-ranking officials, once considered untouchable, were investigated. Local bureaucracies were re-examined. The effort was massive, sometimes controversial, but undeniably transformative. For supporters, it restored public trust. For critics, it signaled a tightening of political discipline. For him, the campaign was a tool to fortify institutions that would guide China through the next several decades. But while domestic efforts shaped the nation's interior, the outside world was changing as well, and his leadership evolved alongside it. Asia was becoming the center of global activity. In Southeast Asia, trade routes bustled with new energy. India was rising. Japan remained a technological powerhouse, and South Korea's industries were expanding rapidly. The region was vibrant, competitive, and strategically vital. And at the center of this dynamic landscape stood China, both an economic engine and a political giant. His approach to the region combined a mixture of cooperation and strategic caution. He sought deeper trade ties with neighboring countries, understanding that economic connections often bridge political tensions. Infrastructure projects expanded across borders, railways, ports, and industrial zones. These projects were not merely economic ventures. They symbolized China's desire to anchor itself more firmly within the continent. Yet, as China's influence grew, so did apprehension. Nations across Asia debated how to engage with a neighbor so large and so rapidly rising. Some welcomed investment and cooperation. Others watched carefully, balancing opportunity with prudence. It was a time of delicate diplomacy, one that required careful steps rather than grand gestures. As he navigated these developments, his worldview became clearer. He believed that China should neither withdraw from the world nor seek dominance. Instead, it should carve out a role that reflected both its historical identity and its modern growth. This mindset shaped his early foreign policies: dialogue where possible, firmness where necessary, and long-term planning at every stage. Beyond Asia, global systems were shifting. The world economy was increasingly interconnected, but also increasingly fragile. Trade relationships evolved, supply chains reorganized, and geopolitical uncertainties intensified. For China, these changes created both pressure and possibility. It was during these years that he began speaking more often about China's responsibility as a major nation. In speeches and meetings, he emphasized that China's rise should be steady rather than abrupt, crossing the river by feeling the stones, as a Chinese proverb says. He was careful to acknowledge that the world was watching, and that China's actions would be interpreted not only through economic numbers, but through the way it engaged with global challenges. Environmental protection became another emerging theme. China's decades of rapid growth had left scars: polluted rivers, hazy skies, and shrinking farmland. Recognizing that environmental issues threatened both quality of life and economic sustainability, he began pushing for more attention to ecological protection. In his narrative, a prosperous China had to be a livable China, one whose development harmonized with the natural world. Meanwhile, technological advancement accelerated. China invested heavily in research, high-speed rail, aerospace, and digital infrastructure. These efforts reflected a deeper shift. China no longer wanted to rely solely on imported technologies. It aimed to cultivate its own innovations, its own industries, its own future. And to do so required a stable, disciplined domestic environment, something he consistently emphasized. Throughout these transitions, one could sense a quiet tension beneath the surface. The tension of a nation stepping into a larger role while still adjusting to its own rapid evolution. For him, leadership was not just about policy, but about narrative, shaping how China understood itself and how the world understood China. Some evenings, he would reflect on China's long arc of history, a civilization thousands of years old, continually rising and rebuilding, defined by cycles of hardship and renewal. In his speeches, he referenced themes of unity, national dignity, and cultural continuity. These were not mere slogans. They were reflections of leaders shaped by decades of observing China at its most complex levels. As Part 3 comes to a close, the scene shifts once more. With domestic consolidation underway and regional influence emerging, China's leader was preparing for the next phase, expanding China's global presence beyond Asia, deepening its role in Africa, Europe, Latin America, and international organizations. These expansions will bring both new opportunities and new challenges, setting the stage for one of the most significant periods of China's modern story. As China stepped deeper into the 2010s, its interactions with the world became broader, more complex, and more visible. The country was no longer simply responding to global currents. It was beginning to shape them. And at the center of this transformation stood the leader who had spent years observing, adjusting, and preparing for a moment when domestic stability would meet global expectation. The early phase of his global engagement began with economic ties. China's growth had already made it central to world trade, but now it started expanding its networks more intentionally. Across Asia, Africa, Europe, and other regions, Chinese investments flowed into roads, ports, logistics hubs, and energy infrastructure. Some projects were small, built quietly in remote towns. Others were massive, connecting entire regions through trade corridors. For many developing nations, China offered something rare: long-term planning, large-scale financing, and a willingness to build what had not existed before. Ports appear along African coasts. New railways connected East Africa. Southeast Asian economies saw factories and industrial zones expand. These landscapes evolved slowly but steadily, carrying the imprint of China's expanding presence. As these partnerships formed, China's leader traveled widely, attending regional summits, visiting partner countries, and hosting foreign leaders in Beijing's grand halls. Each meeting carried the same calm energy he was known for: measured words, careful listening, quiet confidence. Diplomats noted that he rarely rushed. He approached global affairs the same way he once approached local governance: patiently, step by step. Yet global engagement was never simple. In regions where China expanded its role, the reactions were mixed. Some countries saw opportunity, others saw caution. In Europe, governments debated how to balance cooperation with independence. In India and Southeast Asia, the question was how to navigate a rising neighbor. In the United States, discussions turned to strategic competition. For the leader in Beijing, these reactions were unsurprising. He understood that influence, like development, was not something that grew evenly. It rippled, created tension, opened new possibilities, and demanded careful navigation. No major nation could expand its presence without encountering friction. At home, he continued reinforcing the idea that China was entering a new stage of development. Economic reforms deepened, technological ambitions sharpened, environmental commitments strengthened, and cultural confidence became a theme, an encouragement for China to understand its heritage while looking outward. Throughout this period, he carried a particular awareness that China's rise came at a time of global uncertainty. Economic cycles were unpredictable. Major powers shifted their positions. International institutions evolved slowly, sometimes too slowly for a rapidly changing world. He often said that China must remain calm in the midst of storms, reflecting his belief that stability itself was a form of strength. In this broader setting, China took on a more active role in global issues. Climate agreements, economic summits, and multilateral forums increasingly featured China as a central voice, not a dominant one. He understood the world did not operate that way, but a consistent, structured participant. He spoke of shared development, of different countries finding their own paths, and of cooperation over confrontation. These messages were not always received the same way abroad, but they lined up with his long-standing preference for gradual, steady growth rather than dramatic gestures. As China's international presence grew, another transformation happened within the country: technological expansion. High-speed rail, advanced manufacturing, renewable energy, digital payments, and artificial intelligence all surged forward. The world began noticing not only China's economic scale, but its innovation. For him, this shift was deeply symbolic. A nation that once relied heavily on foreign technology was increasingly becoming a country of invention. He encouraged research institutions, supported long-term development, and pushed industries to move beyond basic manufacturing. Innovation, he often suggested, was not simply an economic tool. It was part of national confidence. Still, global tensions rose. In some regions, China's investments sparked debates. In others, shifts in supply chains created new geopolitical conversations. He faced these challenges with the same quiet expression observers had described for decades: a mixture of focus and determination, carved from his early years of hardship. Some evenings, one might imagine him looking out over Beijing's skyline, recognizing that the responsibilities before him had spread far beyond what any previous Chinese leader had experienced in modern history. China was now woven into the world's energy networks, financial systems, digital platforms, and trade routes. Every decision carried global resonance. He also understood that China's global rise brought with it expectations, not only from partner nations, but from its own people. They wanted better living conditions, modern cities, cleaner air, and a future built on stability. Global influence meant little if domestic well-being did not continue to improve. In private moments, he likely reflected on the contrast between his youth in rural Shaanxi's cave dwellings and the complex diplomacy of world summits. The journey from dust-covered farmlands to global negotiations was extraordinary, but it was also a reminder of how much had changed and how much more still lay ahead. As Part 4 draws to a close, China stands firmly as a major global actor, economically, politically, and technologically. The leader who once dealt with village issues now navigates international systems. The country that once followed the world now shapes parts of it. And through all these shifts, he holds fast to the idea that China must advance steadily, avoiding abrupt turns but remaining aware of the evolving global landscape. As the world entered a new era of uncertainty, China found itself at the center of conversations far beyond Asia. The global landscape was shifting. Economies were adjusting. Technology was evolving at unprecedented speed, and geopolitical currents were growing increasingly complex. In this environment, the expectations placed on China's leader expanded dramatically. What once centered on domestic development and regional ties had now grown into a responsibility that extended across continents, touching issues from climate agreements to supply chains, from digital governance to global health. In the early years of this new period, China's role in the world was often described with a mixture of curiosity and caution. For some nations, China represented opportunity, a partner capable of building infrastructure, providing trade, offering investment, and helping them step into modernity. For others, China represented competition, a rising power that reshaped global industries and introduced new patterns of international influence. The leader in Beijing watched these interpretations unfold, aware that China's image abroad was no longer something external. It was now intertwined with every decision at home. He understood that the world had grown too interconnected for walls, too integrated for isolation, too fast-moving for outdated strategies. China's actions, economic, technological, diplomatic, were no longer judged merely in Beijing, Shanghai, or Shenzhen, but Nairobi, Jakarta, Berlin, and Sao Paulo. Inside China society, China's transformation persisted, with young people entering the workforce inhabiting a reality vastly different from their parents' formative years. For many, China had always possessed modern transportation, ubiquitous smartphones, and a thriving presence of global brands. Their expectations reflected this generational shift towards openness, encompassing demands for superior education, cleaner urban environments, innovative industries, accessible opportunities abroad, and profound sense of interconnectedness with the global community. The leader recognized that merely sustaining economic growth would be insufficient to fulfill these aspirations. Adaptation was paramount. China had evolved beyond a developing nation of his youth. It was now a country grappling with the intricate complexities of wealth, modernity, and its expanding global responsibilities. Each transition ushered in new inquiries. How could China foster innovation without sacrificing its unique cultural identity? How could it achieve sustainable growth while safeguarding the environment? How could it project confidence on the world stage without inciting conflict or apprehension? The answers, in many respects, were far from simple. They necessitated comprehensive long-term strategic planning, careful social adjustments, and a deep awareness of the interplay between global challenges and domestic objectives. He championed concepts of modernization, the pursuit of technological self-reliance, the revitalization of rural communities, and a renewed emphasis on advancements in science and education. His addresses frequently returned to the theme of stability, not as a constraint or limitation, but as a fundamental bedrock upon which China could continue its evolution without succumbing to instability or unpredictability. As the world faced economic downturns, widespread health crises, and increasing political fragmentation, China's leader found himself navigating a landscape where effective leadership meant skillfully balancing competing priorities, fostering global cooperation while maintaining national resilience, promoting technological advancement alongside safeguarding security interests, and upholding environmental obligations while mitigating economic pressures. In high-level international meetings, he emphasized the concept of a shared destiny, advocated for robust global partnerships, and stressed the imperative for nations to adapt to an ever-accelerating and evolving world. Yet, he also carried with him a profound understanding shaped by his unique life experiences. The simple cave dwellings of Shaanxi, the bustling factory floors of coastal provinces, the grand avenues of Shanghai, and prestigious summit halls of foreign capitals. These experiences instilled in him a quiet recognition that the path ahead would inevitably be fraught with challenges. Growth would inevitably generate tension. Increased influence would attract greater scrutiny. Leadership, ultimately, would bring a degree of solitude. On certain evenings, when the clamor of political discourse subsided, he might gaze upon a tranquil lake or a sprawling city skyline. Not as a head of state, but as an individual contemplating the monumental changes that had transpired within a single lifetime. He had witnessed China's remarkable ascent from rural hardship to technological ambition, from relative isolation to comprehensive global integration. This transformation was not merely economic or geopolitical. It was deeply emotional, profoundly cultural, and intensely personal. In those private moments, one could envision him contemplating the weighty burden of continuity. China's enduring narrative transcended any single leader, a fact of which he was keenly aware. His task, as he often articulated, was to guide, to provide direction without undue haste, to lead without seeking dominance, and to maintain a steady course through an era where rapid change presented both immense opportunities and potential perils. Meanwhile, China's influence continued to expand subtly but steadily. Cultural exchange programs flourished. Chinese companies gained global recognition and respect. Universities continued to develop and mature. Artists, scientists, and athletes increasingly graced international stages. The world began to recognize not only China as an economic powerhouse, but also China as a multifaceted society, a nation of innovators, dedicated workers, forward thinkers, and ambitious dreamers. In foreign capitals, debates persisted. How should nations effectively respond to China's growing presence and influence? How would existing global systems need to adapt? What would the future geopolitical landscape of Asia look like? These discussions varied significantly, but they all converged on one central point. China had become a force that could no longer be ignored. The leader approached these developments with careful deliberation and foresight. In his public addresses, he consistently promoted mutual respect among nations, advocated for regional stability, and encouraged cooperation on shared global concerns. He recognized and emphasized that every nation possesses its own distinct path, its own unique history, and its own individual aspirations. This perspective, cultivated through decades of observation and experience, became a fundamental cornerstone of his global message. As the decade progressed, China continued to navigate fluctuating global conditions. The world economy underwent shifts and realignments. Technology experienced rapid evolution. International partnerships underwent transformations. Throughout it all, the leader steadfastly maintained his emphasis on long-term planning, social stability, and prudent adaptation. The China that emerged towards the end of this period was demonstrably different from the China he had inherited. It was more confident, more assertive, and more deeply integrated into the global community. Yet, it remained a nation striving for balance, between honoring the past and embracing the future, between ambition and prudence, between openness and caution. As Part 5 draws to a close, the narrative settles into a reflective and thoughtful rhythm. His leadership continues to evolve, shaped by the complex challenges of the 21st century and guided by the invaluable lessons gleaned from a lifetime of profound change. China's presence on the world stage continues its ongoing evolution, sometimes subtly, sometimes conspicuously, but consistently characterized by the unwavering determination that has defined its long and remarkable journey. The saga of China's rise remains an ongoing narrative. The role of its leader remains pivotal, and the world watching with keen interest, continues to adjust as China embarks on the next chapter of its unfolding story.